My husband and his diabolical mother-in-law celebrated my death after poisoning me for my $100 million inheritance, tossing me out like yesterday's trash. But they didn't count on one thing: I survived. The next day, I returned with a master plan to destroy them, and their nightmare was only beginning. My name is Evelyn, and for the longest time, I thought my life was perfect. I was married to Jake, a handsome and ambitious businessman, and we lived in a beautiful home in an affluent suburb of Chicago. To the outside world, I had everything: love, comfort, and security. But behind the closed doors of that house, my life was far from perfect. Jake and I had been married for 5 years. At first, he was everything I could have hoped for: caring, charming, and supportive. Things changed when my father passed away. Losing him was devastating. He was my rock, my biggest supporter. But even in my grief, I felt a glimmer of hope because he left me a $100 million inheritance. I thought it would be a safety net for our future, a way to honor his legacy. Little did I know, it would become the reason my life turned into a nightmare. It all began with Diane, Jake's mother. Diane was in her late 50s, a retired socialite who lived for appearances. She was always impeccably dressed, her smile polished but insincere. I'd always felt she didn't like me, but after my father's passing, her disdain became more obvious. She began spending more time at our house, under the guise of supporting us during a difficult time. But I knew better. Diane wasn't there to support me. She was there to meddle. I noticed small changes at first: Diane whispering to Jake, long conversations that would abruptly end when I entered the room. Jake became distant, snapping at me over trivial matters and questioning my decisions. It hurt, but I chalked it up to grief. I never imagined how deep Diane's manipulations ran. One evening, Diane sat me down in the kitchen. "Evelyn, dear," she began with a sickly sweet tone, "you need to think carefully about your inheritance. Jake and I just want what's best for you. Managing such a large sum can be overwhelming." Her words sounded kind, but her eyes told another story. She wanted control. I brushed her off, saying I had plans to work with my father's trusted financial advisor. Her smile faltered, and I saw a flash of anger. That's when I knew she wouldn't give up easily. A few weeks later, I started feeling unwell: nausea, dizziness, fatigue. At first, I thought it was stress or the grief catching up to me, but it kept getting worse. I noticed it was especially bad after meals. I tried to ignore it, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then came the night that changed everything. I was in the dining room, finishing dinner with Jake and Diane. The food tasted off, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Moments later, the world started spinning. I felt my legs give way, and I collapsed to the floor. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Diane's voice, cold and triumphant. "It's time." When I woke up, I wasn't in my house. I was lying on a park bench, my body weak and trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Had Jake carried me here? Had Diane? Before I could make sense of it, a man's voice broke through my haze. "Miss, are you okay? Can you hear me?" I turned my head to see a kind face, a middle-aged man who looked genuinely concerned. I couldn't speak, but he didn't wait for an answer. He called 911 and stayed with me until the ambulance arrived. His kindness was a lifeline in that moment. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed my worst fears. There were traces of poison in my system. Someone had been poisoning me, and it wasn't a one-time thing. It had been happening over weeks. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut.
Diane, Jake.
They had done this to me.
But why?
The answer became clear when I overheard a conversation between two nurses outside my room. "She's lucky that man found her," one said. "They said she's got a $100 million inheritance. Makes you wonder who'd want her out of the picture." I felt sick, but not from the poison this time. It was from the betrayal. My husband, the man I loved, and his mother had tried to kill me. And for what? Money? Rage filled me, but so did determination. I wasn't going to let them win. I spent the next few days recovering, but I also began planning. Diane and Jake thought they'd gotten away with it, but they didn't realize I was still alive. I didn't know how I would fight back, but I promised myself one thing: I wouldn't let them destroy me. And so, I started my journey, not just to reclaim my inheritance, but to reclaim my life. Little did they know, they had awakened a side of me they'd never seen before. This was far from over. When I left the hospital, I was physically weak, but mentally sharper than ever. I knew I couldn't return home to face Jake and Diane without a plan. They believed they had succeeded in getting rid of me, but I was alive, and that was my advantage. I found refuge in a small hotel a few miles away, using the cash I had on hand to pay for a room. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the betrayal washed over me again. Jake, the man I had vowed to love and honor, had thrown me away like I was nothing. And Diane, her greed knew no bounds. I was done crying. I needed answers, and I needed proof. The first thing I did was call my father's financial advisor, Mr. Stanton. He was one of the few people I trusted completely. "Evelyn," he said, relief evident in his voice when he picked up. "I've been trying to reach you. Is everything all right?" "Not exactly," I admitted. "I think Jake and Diane are trying to steal my inheritance. Can you check if anything unusual has happened with my accounts?" "I'll look into it right away," he assured me. "Stay safe, Evelyn." A few hours later, Stanton called back, his voice grave. "Evelyn, there have been attempts to transfer funds from your accounts into a new trust under Diane's name. The documents claim you authorized it." My heart sank. I didn't. She forged my signature.
"I thought as much," he said.
"I've frozen all activity on your accounts, but you'll need to act fast. They're not going to stop." Hearing that Diane was already trying to steal what was mine lit a fire in me. I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance anymore. I was fighting for justice. I decided to start by gathering evidence. If Diane and Jake had been bold enough to forge documents, they might have left other trails behind. I started with social media. Diane had always been careful about her image, but she underestimated the power of a digital footprint. I combed through her posts and found photos of her at lavish events, wearing expensive jewelry and designer clothes she hadn't known before. Where had she gotten the money? And then there was Jake. His Instagram was filled with cryptic captions like, "The start of a new era," and "Bigger things ahead." My stomach churned at the thought that they were celebrating their plans to ruin me. But social media alone wouldn't be enough. I needed something stronger, something undeniable. I decided to go back to the house, knowing it was a risk. I waited until I knew Diane would be out. She had a standing lunch appointment with her bridge club every Tuesday. Jake would be at work. It was the perfect time. When I entered the house, the familiar scent hit me like a wave of nostalgia and pain. This had been my home, my safe place. Now it felt like enemy territory. I moved quickly, heading to Diane's room first. She kept a lockbox in her closet. I'd seen her put papers in there before. After a few tries, I found the key taped under a drawer. Inside, I hit the jackpot. There were forged documents with my name, copies of my bank statements, and even a handwritten note outlining Plan B if I didn't cooperate. The note mentioned the poison and how Jake would take care of things if I became suspicious. My hands shook as I read it. This wasn't just fraud. This was attempted murder. I took pictures of everything with my phone before putting it all back exactly as I found it. On my way out, I passed the dining room and froze. The chair where I had collapsed that night was still there, a stark reminder of how close I had come to dying. I felt a surge of anger and vowed to make them pay. That evening, I sat in my hotel room, staring at my phone. I had the evidence, but I needed to make sure it reached as many people as possible. That's when the idea hit me: social media. Diane and Jake had spent years curating their image as the perfect family. What better way to shatter it than by exposing their true selves? I created a video, carefully piecing together everything I had. Photos of the forged documents, screenshots of their social media posts, and even my hospital records showing the poison in my system. I narrated the video myself, telling the world what had happened. "My name is Evelyn," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "This is the story of how my husband and his mother tried to kill me for my inheritance." I hesitated before posting it, worried about the fallout. But then I thought of my father, how he had always told me to stand up for what was right. With a deep breath, I hit upload. The response was immediate. Within hours, the video went viral. Comments flooded in, some offering support, others expressing outrage at Jake and Diane. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, the perfect facade they had built was crumbling. Diane's friends from her bridge club, Jake's business associates, even neighbors who had once idolized them, all were shocked. I watched it all unfold from my hotel room, a mix of satisfaction and fear swirling in my chest. This was only the beginning. Diane and Jake wouldn't take this lying down, but neither would I. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. They had tried to silence me, but now the whole world knew the truth. I wasn't going to stop until justice was served. This was my life, my inheritance, and my fight, and I was just getting started. The days after I uploaded the video felt like a whirlwind. My phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years, offering their support. Others were from reporters asking for interviews, but I ignored them. I didn't need fame or publicity, I needed justice. As the world turned against Diane and Jake, I kept a close eye on their movements. From the little I could gather, Diane was furious, and Jake was panicking. They had underestimated me, and now they were scrambling to do damage control. A week later, I received an anonymous message through social media. "I have information about Diane," it read. Skeptical but curious, I responded. The sender turned out to be one of Diane's former friends from her bridge club. She told me that Diane had been borrowing money from everyone she knew, spinning lies about needing it for family emergencies. It was clear now how desperate Diane had been even before my father's inheritance became a target. This was another piece of the puzzle, and I stored the information carefully. My plan was coming together, but I still needed more. I wasn't just going to let them squirm. I wanted airtight evidence that would leave no room for doubt. One afternoon, I received a call from Mr. Stanton, my father's financial advisor. "Evelyn, I think I've found something you'll want to see," he said. "Diane has been working with a shady attorney to create new forged documents. They're trying to make it look like you willingly handed over control of your estate." I clenched my fists, my anger rising. "Can you get me copies of those documents?" "I already have," he replied. "I'll send them over." "Be careful, Evelyn. They're cornered, and that makes them dangerous." Dangerous was an understatement. Diane was already known for her fiery temper, and the public backlash had only made her more unhinged. She had lost friends, her social standing, and her polished reputation. Now, she was blaming me for her downfall, completely ignoring her own actions. I decided it was time to confront Diane directly. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about holding her accountable for everything she'd done. But I wasn't foolish enough to go in unprepared. I knew Diane's temper would be my greatest weapon. I reached out to her through Jake. "Tell your mother to meet me at the family estate," I said. "I want to discuss a settlement." Jake sounded wary but intrigued. "A settlement? You're finally coming to your senses." I bit back the urge to scream. "Let's just say I'm tired of fighting." He agreed to set up the meeting, clearly unaware that I had no intention of settling. Instead, I planned to record everything, hoping Diane would incriminate herself further. The estate, once my home, now felt like a battlefield. I arrived early and set up a hidden camera in the living room, positioning it to capture the entire space. My heart pounded as I waited for Diane. This confrontation could go terribly wrong, but I had to take the risk. When Diane arrived, she was seething. Her eyes burned with anger, and her voice dripped with sarcasm. Well, the prodigal daughter returns. What's this nonsense about a settlement?" I kept my voice steady. "Diane, we need to end this before it gets worse. Let's talk." She crossed her arms and smirked. "Talk? Oh, sweetheart, the time for talking is over. You ruined everything. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to keep this family together? And for what? So you could play the victims?" I stayed calm, knowing she was walking straight into my trap. "You tried to kill me, Diane. How is that keeping the family together?" Her smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl. You don't understand anything. That money should have been ours. Jake deserved it, not you. You think you're some saint, but you're just as selfish as the rest of us. She was unraveling, and I let her continue. Jake and I did what we had to do. If you'd just handed over the inheritance like a good little wife, none of this would have happened. I stared at her, feigning shock. So, you admit it? You poisoned me? You forged those documents. Her face turned red, and she screamed, yes. And I'd do it again, if it meant getting rid of you. My hands trembled, but I held her gaze. Thank you for being honest, Diane. Before she could respond, I stood up and walked to the hidden camera, pulling it from its spot. Diane's eyes widened as realization dawned. What is that? I held it up, my heart racing. Proof. Proof that you and Jake tried to destroy me. This is going straight to the police and the court. Diane lunged at me, her nails digging into my arm. You littles. I pushed her off and stepped back, my voice steady.
You've lost, Diane.
It's over. She screamed in frustration, but I didn't stay to watch her tantrum. I walked out of the estate, the hidden camera clutched tightly in my hand. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. That night, I reviewed the footage, my stomach churning at the venom in Diane's words. But I also felt a flicker of hope. This was the evidence I needed to finally take them down. Diane had revealed her true self, and now the world would see her for who she really was. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I prepared for the next battle, court. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. This wasn't just about reclaiming my inheritance anymore. This was about reclaiming my life. And I wasn't going to let Diane or Jake take that away from me ever again. The day of the trial arrived faster than I expected. I was nervous, but determined. Diane and Jake would be there, facing the consequences of their actions, and I was ready to expose their lies. I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance, I was fighting for my dignity and my life. The courtroom was filled with tension. Diane sat beside Jake, her expression cold and defiant, while Jake avoided looking at me altogether. The once confident man I had married now seemed small and insignificant. It was strange to think I had ever loved him. My lawyer started with the recordings I had captured during my confrontation with Diane. The courtroom was silent as her voice echoed through the speakers, her venomous confession playing for everyone to hear. Yes, and I'd do it again, if it meant getting rid of you. Her words hung in the air, and I could see the judge's expression harden. Diane's lawyer tried to object, but it was clear they had no defense. The evidence was damning. Next came the forged documents. Mr. Stanton had testified earlier about Diane's attempts to transfer my inheritance into her name. He explained the forged signatures, the illegal transactions, and how he had managed to stop them just in time. The jury was visibly shocked as each piece of evidence stacked against Diane and Jake. When it was my turn to testify, I told my story, starting from the night I collapsed at the dining table. I described the betrayal, the poisoning, and the moment I realized the people I trusted most had plotted to end my life for money. My voice trembled at times, but I didn't hold back. This was my truth, and I wasn't going to let fear silence me. The prosecution presented the medical evidence, hospital reports confirming the poison in my system, and the timeline that matched Diane's presence in the house. The Good Samaritan who found me testified about how he had seen me unconscious and called for help. His sincerity was a stark contrast to Diane's cold demeanor. Then came the turning point. Diane took the stand, and it was clear she was unraveling. At first, she tried to play the victim, accusing me of being manipulative and stealing her family. But the prosecutor was relentless. He cornered her with the recordings, the forged documents, and her own web of lies. Under pressure, Diane lost her composure. I did what I had to do, she shouted, her voice shaking with anger. She didn't deserve that money. Jake and I... Her lawyer tried to stop her, but the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and I felt a wave of relief. Diane's true colors were on full display, and there was no hiding now. Jake, on the other hand, was pathetic. When it was his turn to testify, he shifted blame onto Diane, claiming he had only gone along with her plan out of fear. I didn't know she would go that far, he stammered, avoiding eye contact with me. His cowardice was almost laughable. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the verdict was worth every moment. Diane and Jake were found guilty of fraud, attempted murder, and forgery. The judge sentenced them to 10 years in prison. As the gavel came down, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Justice had been served. But my story didn't end there. After the trial, I had a choice to make. Jake had written me a letter from prison, begging for forgiveness and asking me to wait for him. Diane, of course, had made no such gesture. Her pride wouldn't allow it. But I knew what I had to do. I filed for divorce. Jake had shown me his true colors, and I couldn't go back to the life I had before. My inheritance was secure, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my independence. I was no longer the naive woman who had let Diane and Jake control her life. Walking away from that chapter wasn't easy. I had loved Jake once, and part of me grieved for the life we could have had if he had been a better man. But I knew I deserved better. I deserved a life free from manipulation, greed, and betrayal. With Diane and Jake behind bars, their reputations destroyed, I began to rebuild. I used part of my inheritance to start a charity in my father's name, helping women escape toxic relationships and rebuild their lives. It felt like the perfect way to honor him and give back to others who needed a second chance. As for Diane and Jake, they faded into the background of my life. I heard through the grapevine that they struggled in prison, their once perfect image shattered. Diane, who had thrived on control and appearances, couldn't handle the reality of her situation. Jake, without his mother to guide him, floundered. I didn't revel in their downfall, but I didn't pity them either. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. For me, it was enough to know that I had survived their schemes and come out stronger on the other side. Now, as I sit here telling my story, I feel a sense of peace. It wasn't easy to confront the people who tried to destroy me, but it was worth it. I learned that resilience isn't just about surviving, it's about standing up, speaking out, and reclaiming your power. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine. And that, more than anything, is the victory I hold on to. This was my story, and I reclaimed it with courage, dignity, and an unshakable sense of self-worth.